Hello everyone. Welcome back. Tonight's story is meant to be listened to with the lights off, maybe with some rain in the background, and your eyes slowly closing as the story unfolds. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and I've got plenty more stories just like this on the way. Now, get comfortable, and let's begin. The night. The streetlights turned off. There was a stretch of nights when no one in town seemed to sleep very well. People still woke up early. The gas station still opened before sunrise. The diner still poured coffee into thick white mugs for the same men at the counter. The grocery store still unlocked its doors at 8. The hardware store still rolled up its front shade and dragged the sign onto the sidewalk. Everything still looked normal. That was the strange part. If you drove through town in the daytime, you wouldn't have noticed anything wrong at all. Kids rode their bikes down cracked sidewalks. Lawns got watered in the evening. Radios drifted from open garage doors. Mothers called their children inside when the lights started to fade. Porch swings creaked. Dogs barked at passing cars and forgot why they were barking a moment later. Ceiling fans turned lazily in front windows. Nothing looked haunted. Nothing looked cursed. Nothing even looked unusual. But every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., every streetlight in town turned off at once. Not one by one, not block by block, all at once. They didn't flicker. They didn't dim. They didn't hum louder first like old lights sometimes do when they're about to fail. They were simply there 1 second, pouring that dull orange glow over the sidewalks and lawns and empty roads. And then the next second, they were gone. And for a little while after that, the town didn't feel like the same town anymore. People didn't talk about it. Not directly. If it ever came up, it was always as a joke or a shrug or a quick change of subject. Someone would say the wiring must be bad. Someone else would say the town should really do something about it, even though ours wasn't the kind of place that ever really did anything about anything. Then the conversation would drift away, and everyone would act like that was enough. But there's difference between not talking about something and not noticing it. Everyone noticed. The town got quieter after midnight than any place had a right to be. Not peaceful quiet, not sleepy quiet, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing, the kind of quiet that seemed to press in from every direction. There were other things too. Dogs that barked all evening would go silent a few minutes before 2:17. Television sometimes got a little fuzzy around then, just a brief shimmer across the screen, like a hand passing over a signal. Clocks seemed louder. Floorboards seemed louder. Even the refrigerators in people's kitchens made strange sounds in the minutes leading up to it. Long, low clicks and soft groans that sounded less mechanical than they should have. No one talked about those things either. I started paying attention because of Danny. Before that, the streetlights were just another odd little part of town life, like the diner that stayed open all night even when nobody seemed to be inside, or the radio station that sometimes played songs no one recognized, songs that sounded old but unfamiliar, like they had been recorded somewhere far away and then drifted into our town by mistake. Danny and I spent a lot of time behind the grocery store that summer. There wasn't anything special about the place. It was just quiet and out of the way. and nobody cared if you parked there after closing. The pavement behind the building was cracked and patched in different shades of gray. A dented dumpster sat against the back wall near a stack of broken wooden pallets. There was a single overhead light that buzzed constantly and threw down a weak yellow circle that never seemed large enough to cover the whole alley. Moths and beetles drifted around it all night, tapping against the glass. We sat on the hood of his car with warm sodas in our hands and watched nothing happen. That's what most nights were in town. Nothing happening. But when you live somewhere long enough, you learn that nothing happening doesn't always mean nothing is there. "You ever really watch the lights?" Danny asked one night. I looked over. "What do you mean?" "The streetlights. They shut off," I said. "Everybody knows that." Danny shook his head once, slowly. "No, I mean really watch them." I waited. He stared out past the alley toward the road. "They don't turn off like normal lights." I laughed a little. "What does that even mean?" "It means they don't act dead," he said. "They act removed." That was the kind of thing Danny would say sometimes. He had a way of noticing details that other people let pass. Usually I ignored it, but there was something in his voice that night that made me listen. "Stay up tonight," he said. "Watch from your window." "And then what?" He looked at me for a little too long before answering. "And then don't go outside." I smiled because I thought he was trying to be dramatic. He didn't smile back. That was the part I kept thinking about later. Not what he said. The fact that he looked serious when he said it. That night, I tried to sleep. I really did. But the house felt different once everything settled down. Not louder, not exactly, just more noticeable. The creak of the hallway, the hum in the walls, the refrigerator shifting in the kitchen, a loose branch rubbing lightly against the side of the house when the wind moved. I lay there staring at the ceiling until I gave up. Then I got out of bed and went to the window. Outside, the street looked completely ordinary. The lawns were pale under the streetlights. Driveways lay in soft orange bands. A parked truck across the street looked almost gold beneath the lamp on the corner. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed strange. I checked the clock on my nightstand. 2:15. I stood there, arms folded, feeling slightly stupid. The minute changed. Then another. 2:17. Every streetlight went out at once. The change was so sudden, it made my eyes hurt. 1 second the road was visible and familiar. The next it was swallowed. The darkness that replaced the light didn't feel normal. That's the only way I can describe it. I knew logically that it was just dark. That's all. The lights were off, so of course it was dark. But it didn't feel like the kind of darkness that belongs to an empty street in a sleeping town. It felt thicker, more complete, like something had settled over everything and sealed it shut. The shape of the road was still there. The houses were still there. The trees were still there. But they all looked wrong. Farther away somehow, less certain. I leaned closer to the glass. The end of the street was difficult to make out. The lamp on the corner was gone, and without it, the intersection felt farther from my house than it should have. The tree near the miller's mailbox looked taller. The shadows between parked cars seemed deeper than they had any right to be. Then something shifted at the end of the block. Not clearly. Not enough to call it a figure. Just a movement. A change in the darkness. I held still. Nothing happened after that. No sound, no shape, no second movement. Then, after what couldn't have been more than half a minute, the lights came back all at once. The street returned instantly. The tree looked normal again. The road looked normal again. The parked truck across the street was once again just a truck. Everything snapped back into place so fast it made the darkness feel even less real. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, the town looked the same as always, but I couldn't stop noticing how tired everyone seemed. The woman at the gas station blinked too slowly when she handed back change. A man in line at the diner stared at the coffee machine like he had forgotten what it was for. At the grocery store, the cashier paused halfway through ringing someone up and just stood there for a second, looking past them with a blank expression before finishing. Maybe I only saw those things because I was watching for them. Maybe not. That evening, I found Danny behind the grocery store again. I watched, I told him. He nodded like he'd expected me to. And, he said, and it was weird. He looked at me. Weird how? I searched for the right word but couldn't find one. Wrong. He gave a small, humorless smile. Yeah. What is it? He took a sip of his soda and kept looking out toward the road. I don't know. That answer bothered me more than if he'd said nothing at all. You're the one who brought it up. I know. Then how do you not know? He tapped the cold ring left by the soda can on the hood with one finger. Because I only know what it feels like. And what does it feel like? He was quiet for a while. Then he said, like the town is holding its breath. That line stayed with me. Not because it sounded spooky. Because it felt accurate. The next few nights I kept watching from the window. At 2:17, the lights went out. Each time the darkness felt too deep. Each time the street felt changed in small ways I couldn't fully explain. One night the shadow of the big oak across the street stretched in the wrong direction. One night the stop sign at the corner seemed farther away than normal. One night I could have sworn the porch swing at the house 2 doors down was moving slowly, even though there was no wind at all. Then another night I heard footsteps, slow ones, measured, not running, not wandering, just walking. I looked all over the street and saw no one. The sound moved from one side of the road to the other. Then it stopped. The lights came back on. There was no one there. The next day I went looking for Danny earlier than usual. He was already behind the store, sitting on the hood of his car, with both hands around a cup from the diner. The overhead light above us buzzed and spat tiny insects down onto the pavement. I heard something last night, I said. He looked up, but not surprised. Footsteps? I stared at him. How did you know that? He rubbed a thumb along the rim of the cup. Because that's what comes next. I didn't like the way he said it. What do you mean comes next? He shrugged, but it wasn't casual. First you notice the lights, then you notice the street feels wrong. Then you hear them. Them? Danny didn't answer. "Who's them?" Again, he said nothing. The silence around us felt different after that. Even the buzzing light overhead seemed quieter. Finally, I said, "You've gone outside during it, haven't you?" He took too long to answer. "Once." "What happened?" He stared at the grocery store wall, like the peeling paint on the bricks was more interesting than the conversation. "It wasn't the same street," he said. I laughed once, nervously. "What does that mean?" "It looked like our street," he said. "But it wasn't." I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. So I asked, "What did you see?" "Nothing at first." "At first?" He finally looked at me. "That's the problem. You keep thinking if you can't see anything, nothing's there." I asked him what he meant, but he just told me not to go out there. That should have stopped me. It didn't. The thing about being told not to do something in a town where nothing ever happens is that it becomes the most interesting thing in the world. The next night I stayed awake again. At 2:16, instead of standing by the window, I stood in the front hallway with my hand on the doorknob. The house felt colder than before. Not freezing, just cooler than it should have been for the time of year. The clock in the living room ticked so loudly I could hear each second separately. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator clicked and gave off a long, soft hum that sounded almost human for an instant. I opened the door before the lights went out. The porch was washed in orange from the street lamp at the curb. The neighborhood looked ordinary. A bicycle lay on its side in a yard down the street. A dog bowl sat on someone's porch. A newspaper, still rolled and bound with a rubber band, rested by a front step where no one had bothered to pick it up. 2:17. The lights disappeared. The world changed. I didn't step out right away. I stood on the porch and stared. The street was still there. The houses were still there. But something about the arrangement of everything felt slightly wrong, like I was looking at a copy made from memory. The road felt too wide. The distance between porches felt uneven. The tree branches moved, though the air was still. The darkness between houses wasn't flat black. It felt layered, deep. Then I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. They were coming from the far end of the block, slow, even, unhurried. I couldn't see anyone. The sound kept coming. Step, 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 not loud, but clear. I stepped back into the doorway without meaning to. The footsteps reached the middle of the street, then stopped. Silence. The kind that feels alive. Then I heard something else. A whisper, not words, not exactly. More like a sound trying to become words. It was soft enough that I couldn't tell where it came from. Ahead of me, to my left, behind me, every direction at once. I shut the door and locked it. I stood there with my hand still on the lock, listening to my own breathing. A few moments later, the lights came back. The next day, a woman who lived 3 streets over came into the diner and asked where her husband was. People at the counter looked at her strangely. She said he hadn't come home. She kept saying his name. No one seemed to know who she meant. Not because they didn't care, because they genuinely didn't understand. She described him, his truck, where he worked, where he liked to fish on weekends. The men at the counter exchanged uncomfortable looks. One of them said maybe she hadn't slept enough. Another asked if she meant her brother instead. She looked at all of them like they were the ones losing their minds. I only heard about it because the waitress mentioned it to someone at the grocery store later that day, and by then she was laughing nervously, telling the story like it was just one of those odd moments people have when they get too stressed. But she wasn't really laughing. Not with her eyes. That evening, I went straight to Danny. Before I could say anything, he said, "Someone asked about a missing person today." I stopped. "You heard too?" He nodded. "Do you know him?" Danny looked away. "No." But something in his face told me he meant something else. Not that he didn't know the man, more like he couldn't. "Did it happen before?" I asked. He was quiet. Then he said, "I think so." "You think so?" He rubbed at his forehead like he had a headache. "That's the problem. I can never hold on to it for very long." I felt a cold heaviness settle in my stomach. "What do you mean?" He pointed to the pocket of my shirt. "You still writing things down?" I blinked. "How did you know that?" "Because I started doing it too." He pulled a folded stack of paper from his jacket and handed it to me. The pages were covered in cramped writing. Names, dates, short sentences. Most of them didn't mean anything to me. On one page he had written, "If I forget again." The Miller house felt empty before sunrise. On another, heard 3 sets of footsteps, not one. On another, do not answer if it speaks clearly. I looked up at him. "What is this?" "It's what I can keep before it gets taken." "Taken by what?" He swallowed and looked out at the road. "I don't know." The overhead light buzzed above us. A moth hit the glass again and again, throwing a tiny frantic shadow over Danny's face. He took the papers back and folded them carefully. Then he said, "If you keep watching, it starts noticing you back." I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. Later that night, I started my own notebook. I wrote down everything: the lights, the darkness, the footsteps, the woman at the diner. Danny's pages, the way the town felt before 217, the way it felt after. I wrote until my hand cramped, because some part of me was already afraid that if I didn't, I would lose it. When I finished, I checked the clock. 2:11. I hadn't meant to get so close to the time. The room suddenly felt smaller. The notebook pages looked brighter in the lamplight. I set the pen down and went to the window. Outside, everything looked ordinary again. Ordinary, but fragile. Like a picture taped together in too many places. At 2:17, the lights went out. I waited. The footsteps came almost immediately. Not one set. More than one. Spread apart, moving at different speeds. One along the far sidewalk. One in the street. One somewhere I couldn't place at all. I stared so hard that my eyes watered, trying to pull shapes out of the dark. Then, for the first time, I saw one, only for a second. Only because it crossed the faint lighter patch where the street should have been. It wasn't clear, it wasn't solid. It was only the suggestion of a tall figure moving where no figure should have been. too thin, too smooth in the way it moved. Like it wasn't walking so much as arriving in one place and then the next. I stepped back from the window so quickly I hit the dresser behind me. The whispering began again, faint, too soft to understand, but closer than before. When the lights came back, my room felt colder. I looked down at the notebook on my desk. For a second, I had the strong, sudden fear that the pages would be blank. They weren't. Not yet. But one line near the bottom of the page wasn't in my handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before I could make myself breathe normally again. It said, "It sees the window too." I don't know how long I stood there looking at those words. Long enough that my legs started to ache. Long enough for the house to begin making its normal sounds again. Long enough for me to start trying to explain it away. Maybe I wrote it without thinking. Maybe I copied something from Danny's notes. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. None of those explanations felt true. The next morning, I tore that page out and folded it into my pocket. I carried it with me all day. At the diner, people spoke in low voices. At the gas station, the clerk rang up a customer and forgot to hand him his change until he asked twice. At school, someone mentioned a teacher who hadn't shown up in 3 days, and half the room seemed unsure if that teacher had ever actually worked there or not. Nobody stayed on the subject long. That was becoming the worst part. Not the forgetting itself. The way the town seemed to slide away from things. The way every conversation that got too close to whatever was happening immediately lost its footing and drifted off somewhere safer. That afternoon, I showed Danny the page from my notebook. He read the line and went very still. "I didn't write that," I said. He handed it back without speaking. "Danny." He finally looked at me. "Then it's getting closer." "What is?" He gave a tired shake of his head. "I keep thinking if I name it, that'll make it worse." I wanted to tell him that not naming it was already making everything worse. But before I could, he said, "Don't watch from your room tonight." I frowned. "Why?" "Because if it knows where you are, it'll keep coming back there." The overhead light buzzed once, loud enough to make us both glance up. It wasn't even dark yet, and the sound made my stomach tighten. "Then where do I watch from?" I asked. Danny stared out toward the road again. "Not home." That night, a little before midnight, I walked to the edge of town where the old baseball field sat behind the school. No one used it much anymore, except for Little League in the spring. By late summer, the bleachers were empty, and the infield went hard and dry. The chain-link fence rattled when the wind hit it. The dugout smelled like dust and stale bubble gum. From there you could see a broad section of town without being directly on any residential street. I climbed the bleachers and sat near the top. The metal still held a little warmth from the day. The town spread out in front of me in soft bands of orange light and darkness. Rooftops, trees, parking lots, the diner sign glowing near the main road, the gas station canopy, the water tower rising above everything, painted white but looking gray in the dark. From up there, the town seemed smaller than it did when you were inside it. Contained, manageable, like something you could understand if you looked long enough. At 2:17, all the streetlights went out. The town didn't just go dark, it seemed to flatten. The shapes of things became uncertain. Streets that should have been obvious vanished. Buildings lost their edges. The spaces between blocks seemed to widen. For a few seconds, it looked less like a town and more like the memory of one. Then the movement began. From that distance, I could see them more clearly. Not clearly enough to describe, but clearly enough to know there were several. Tall shapes moving along the roads where no one should have been. Gliding almost, though I could still hear the faint rhythm of footsteps carried across the field. They moved through the streets in slow, deliberate paths. At intersections they paused. At certain houses they lingered. At others they passed without slowing at all. I counted 4 before I lost one in the dark. Then I saw a 5th moving behind the diner. Then a 6th near the grain silos. The whispering reached me even out there, thin, soft, like wind through something hollow. And then one of them stopped. It was far away, somewhere near the middle of town. But I felt the moment it stopped. I knew somehow that it had lifted its head, that it was no longer moving through the town, that it was looking back, toward the field, toward me. I didn't wait to see more. I went down the bleachers too fast, nearly missed the last step, caught myself on the fence, and started walking home at a pace that was not quite running. I didn't look over my shoulder once. When I got back to my room, the lights had already returned. My notebook was open on the desk where I had left it. I knew I had closed it. I was sure of that. A new line had been written at the bottom of the page. You should not have watched from so far away. I stared at the words until the letters blurred. Then I sat down and with shaking hands wrote one sentence under it. What do you want? I don't know why I wrote that. Maybe fear makes people do stupid things. Maybe part of me had already stopped believing this was impossible. I waited there for a long time, staring at the page. Nothing else appeared. But when I finally forced myself to go to bed, I couldn't escape the feeling that something in town now knew exactly where I was, and that whatever had been moving through the streets at 2:17 was no longer just passing by. It had started to pay attention.